And we are here today, and I think we're also going to, I believe, be joined by the Senate President, I think, join us as well. Okay, so we're here on the topic of supplemental project and the process, and there's been a fair amount written in the press. And I think what we're trying to understand from the standpoint of this committee is how long has FERC operated this supplemental project process? What's the level of review FERC undertakes? Is there a role for the PSC? Is there a role for PJM? If not, how's utility company determine that a supplemental project is warranted? I think those are sort of some of the basic questions we want to get a sense of. Now, for the committee, we do have on your desk copies of documents that you're going to see blueprint. But included in your packet is a document called Formula Rates and Electric Transmission Proceedings from FERC, our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They're not testifying today, but they have some pending proceedings, which made that not possible, but they did submit this document for everybody to take a look at. And so with that background, we're going to and then also not at the witness table is the Public Service Commission. Mr. Baker is in the back. Just if questions pop up and we want to get a PSC, Public Service Commission perspective on things, and we do have Senate President and his shadow for the day as well, the other Mr. Ferguson. Okay, so that's the layout. We've got, again, Mr. Baker in the back from Public Service Commission just for questions. I laid out, I think, some of the key topics that we want to cover, and you've got the handouts at your desk. And with that, I'm going to tell you who we have in front of us. We've got Jason Stanek, our former Public Service Commission chair, and now the Executive Director of Government Services for PJM, our grid operator, RTO. Amber Thomas, a Senior Manager of Transmission Strategy at Exelon. And Rob Lemming, Vice President of Strategic and Regulatory Affairs at Pepco Holdings. John Frame, Vice President of Strategic and Regulatory Affairs for BGE. And finally, Michael Argentino, Principal Project Manager of the Port Covington Transmission Project for BGE. So that is our group of 5 witnesses. We're not timing you today. We're going to start with Mr. Stanek and go down, and then we'll take questions from the members. And that's, I think, the plan for today. So with that, Mr. Stanek, you can proceed with your presentation, and we'll see where that leads, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, Mr. President, and Senators. As you may know, PJM is your wholesale RTO, Regional Transmission Organization. We are the grid operator not only for Maryland, but for 12 other states and the District of Columbia. In addition to running the grid and dispatching power, we also are the primary planner for the wholesale grid, where we plan for the needs of your utilities and your citizens not only tomorrow, but upwards of 20 years into the future. As you may know, I have a background both as a federal regulator at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and at the state regulatory body. So transmission planning in the United States is split, and the regulation of transmission is split both between federal authorities and the states. FERC, the federal regulator, exclusively regulates transmission rules as well as rates, whereas the state regulators, in Maryland, the PSC, they exclusively regulate retail rates and the distribution utilities. They do not regulate the transmission owners, which in this case, in Maryland's instance, all of the transmission owners are associated with incumbent utilities, whether it be BGE, Pepco, Delmarva, or First Energy. Today we're discussing transmission planning. And transmission assets in Maryland are either directly planned by PJM or by the transmission owners themselves. Regional projects, we call them baseline projects, these are informed by reliability needs, are planned by PJM. Whereas the states, the transmission owners at the table, those projects, if they're a local level, otherwise known as a supplemental project, those are planned by the transmission owners. The State Public Service Commission does not approve any transmission investments in the state, and they cannot disallow any FERC jurisdictional costs that will ultimately be accepted into formula rates, which have been in effect at FERC for approximately 25 years now. So I'll first touch on PJM's role with respect to planning for regional needs, and oftentimes these are interstate transmission lines. And what you have in front of you is a one-page fact sheet which explains how PJM performs that. The top right corner, you'll see that we take into account a number of needs and drivers, whether it be costs, efficiencies, performance, or ultimately impact to the grid. More importantly, I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom graphic, which shows the life cycle of transmission planning for these large baseload projects. And it begins with PJM identifying a particular need for a transmission project. We then open a competitive solicitation for bidders, both incumbents and merchants, to bid on those projects. And then we have a robust stakeholder process, which is oftentimes attended by OPC, PSC, other interested state parties in these public proceedings. PJM, after reviewing a number of proposals, will determine which is the best solution to address the problem. That is voted on by our board of directors, which is an independent board, and then ultimately filed with FERC before there's a handoff to local entities, including the Public Service Commission, to site any transmission infrastructure. Today, we'll also be discussing a different type of project called supplemental projects, otherwise known as local projects. Those at the table will address the various drivers for the needs of these projects. Oftentimes, they are resulting from the need to replace aging assets, to provide service to new customer bases that did not exist before, or to be proactive and avoid waiting for existing infrastructure to become at a state where it needs to be replaced. PJM does not approve these local or supplemental projects, nor do we propose them. So these are self-identified by the transmission-owning utilities. They are presented in a forum at PJM, where PJM does review them, but we do not review them for need. What we do review them is for any potential harm that this project could cause on the greater transmission grid. So it's called a do no harm study that PJM performs. There are some public-facing meetings where the TO will effectively identify the assumptions of why such a project is required, what a potential need is, and what the solution is. All of these requirements are detailed under PJM's Attachment 3 to its open access transmission tariff. So these are all documents, governing documents that have been reviewed and approved by FERC. Particularly supplemental projects have recently been litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, and there's currently litigation pending at FERC with respect to supplemental projects as well. The process that we have used for many, many years has been tried and true, but there is obviously a distinction between these baseline projects that go through our review process and supplemental projects that are driven by local needs and that are initiated by our transmission-owning utilities. We recognize that there has been some consternation at the state level in a number of our states with respect to visibility into supplemental projects. FERC is aware of this consternation. However, because of the formula rate methodology that FERC uses to recover some of these rates, we have heard that is oftentimes difficult for parties to challenge these projects before the state body. It is not impossible to file a complaint at FERC, but there is a mechanism, since they are the exclusive regulator of both regional projects and local projects. That is the forum to address these, as opposed to the Public Service Commission, which has no authority there. So I hope that background in the distinction of both transmission versus distribution, as well as regional versus supplemental projects, transmission projects, is helpful, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I think just for efficiency standpoint, rather than breaking it up Q&A after each witness, why don't we just go through the panel? We just have 5 witnesses, then we can take questions for anybody. Ms. Thomas, why don't you go next?
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chair, Vice Chair, members, and attendees of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. So again, my name is Amber Thomas, and I'm the Senior Manager of Transmission Strategy, which really focuses on transmission planning as well as policy development in both BGE, PEPCO, and the rest of the Exelon OPCOs. So my testimony is really going to pick up from where Mr. Stanek left off, really providing more information about the supplemental planning process, which at times I may say M3 process, since they are synonyms to each other. So let's start first with the drivers of supplemental planning process. So with a lot of these projects that are initiated by transmission owners such as BGE, DPL, or even PEPCO, they really fall into about 4 major buckets. One of the buckets is going to be operational improvements. Another of the buckets will be resilience. One of the bigger ticker item ones is end of life, so facilities that are reaching the end of their life, so we want to go in and replace those before they actually do fail. And probably one of the last bigger ones is customer service. So when new customers are looking to come online to the system, or even when existing customers are there and they're ramping up their load for various reasons. And so what ends up happening within the PJM stakeholder process is once a year we have an annual assumptions meeting, and this is for all of the transmission owners within PJM. And so during that assumptions meeting, which is several hours long, where each of the transmission owners are going over their planning methodology, their criterias, the types of analysis that we're going to be running over this essentially 15-year time horizon. So it's really providing notice to all stakeholders of the different things that we're going to be considering before we actually bring through any sort of needs or solutions, or before a project is ever actually put into PJM's regional transmission expansion plan process. After that annual assumptions meeting, which generally takes place at December of every year, going into January, that's when transmission owners will begin to present different needs. So when we're presenting different needs, the meeting is focused on a particular need that we have on our system. So that's where we would come forth and say, hey, essentially, well, not hey, but we would come forth and say, we have a customer service project where a new customer is looking to come online and their load is going to be 50 megawatts in 5 years down the future, or even 3 years down the future. So we're providing stakeholders with information to let them know we have this need coming up. Or as another example, we'll tee up that a transformer is reaching the end of its life, and we're unable, due to obsolescence or vendor issues, able to continue to maintenance that particular transformer. So we're informing stakeholders that we will likely need to replace that particular asset. The next step in the process would then be to have a solutions meeting, where at the solutions meeting, we are re-reviewing what the need was that we previously discussed. And then at the solutions meeting, we are teeing up what the potential solution is to address that particular need, and if there are feasible alternatives that we considered, whether it's the assumptions meeting, the needs meeting, or even the solutions meeting, we are working with PJM, where all of this information and the material supporting it is posted on PJM's website. PJM, through their various list servers, they send communications out letting folks know that the agendas and the materials are posted. And so it gives stakeholders an opportunity to provide us with questions and feedback, both before the meetings occur, when the meetings occur, and even after the meetings occur. And if any of you have participated in the PJM process, you'll recognize that the PJM stakeholder process is a very lively bunch. And so folks aren't afraid at all to provide questions or comments, to which we're generally responsive to them. And for those who haven't maybe participated in the PJM stakeholder process meeting, let me be clear on the different types of folks who actually participate. It'll be folks from FERC Commission, from the various state commissions. It'll be suppliers, generator owners, everyday customers who want to better understand why we're looking to build something else in their backyard. It'll be different end users that will come to these meetings, legislators themselves that come to these different meetings. So again, these meetings are public, the materials are out there, and we are responsive to folks before, during, and after the meeting. And there's even a website on PJM's site that allows for folks to continue to submit questions to us. Now, after we have gone through the assumptions meeting, presented the need, presented the solution, as Mr. Stanek noted, PJM will then begin to do a do no harm analysis, where they're ultimately evaluating the project to not only make sure that it's not causing harm to the rest of the TO zone, but it's not causing harm to the rest of the footprint within PJM generally regarding its transmission assets. And then at that point, PJM will incorporate the projects into a local plan, which is then posted for comment once more, so stakeholders are aware that this project is now moving forward, and then the project would be incorporated into the regional transmission expansion plan. Also on PJM's website, there's a website there that provides information, not just about supplemental projects, but also network upgrades for generators, as well as the baseline projects that Mr. Stanek referenced. And it provides what's the status of the projects. Is it an engineering procurement? Is it on hold? Has it started construction? Is it in service? What are the cost updates to the project? What's the projected in-service dates? And so TOs such as BGE, PEPCO, and DPL, we work with PJM and we're regularly pushing information out to those websites. That way stakeholders are aware of updates to the project, such as Port Covington, where we brought Port Covington through the M3 process, right? So we reviewed with stakeholders the assumptions regarding that project, went over the needs and the solutions back in the 2019 timeframe. And back in 2022, that's when we first provided information to PJM, which was published on their website, indicating to folks that the cost had increased. And so, again, this is a very transparent process. It's a very robust and thorough process, and stakeholders have ample amounts of opportunity to come and have those conversations with not only BGE, DPL, and PEPCO, but really all of the PJM transmission owners. I do just want to further highlight that, recognizing that this M3 process, the supplemental planning process, it had been unique to just a PJM footprint for many years, because to be fair, supplemental projects have been around probably since the inception of PJM. There was always three major projects: baselines, supplementals, and network upgrades for generators. And we formalized this with the FERC back in the 2018 timeframe. And so we've been working at this process we're going into 8 years now. And this process, because of its robustness, because of its transparency, the FERC recently adopted elements of it as part of its FERC 1920 process. So I'm just looking over my notes. Okay, yeah, so thanks you all for allowing me to take the time to explain the M3 process, and I will hand it over to Mr. Lemming.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Thomas. Okay, Mr. Lemming.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? All right. Good afternoon, Mr.
Here, actually, put that a little closer so the world can hear what you have to say, okay?
All right. Is that better? Great. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, Mr. President, members of the committee, and folks in attendance this afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Rob Lemming. I am the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and strategy for Pepco Holdings. My testimony this afternoon, I'd like to elaborate a little bit. You heard from Mr. Stanek from PJM about their role in this process, as well as my colleague, Ms. Thomas, around how our utilities engage in the PJM planning processes. And I'd like to make sure I have an opportunity to provide clarity on how those planning and transparency processes really work in collaboration and conjunction with federal oversight to ensure that there is transparency and comprehensive review around transmission investments, both from a grid level and from a federal oversight perspective. So as I noted, you heard from Mr. Stanek about PJM's role in this process, and just want to underscore one very key point that he made, and that is that PJM is a grid operator. As he mentioned, it plans and operates the transmission system across 13 states, including the District of Columbia. The primary role here in a lot of this is ensuring that there is coordination, transparency, and alignment around needed transmission investments, that assumptions are shared, needs are understood, there is engagement from stakeholders in the processes around solutions that are being considered before projects are moved forward with. What I'm underscoring here is the transparency this process provides, but what I want to make sure is abundantly clear is this is not a process or a mechanism for approving cost recovery or authorizing spend. That occurs through the regulatory oversight process that is held at the FERC level, and that includes cost recovery around these investments. So federal law has assigned FERC full authority over interstate transmission. They determine whether transmission investments are prudent and whether the resulting rates that come from them are just and reasonable before any of those costs are passed along to any of our customers. And courts have reinforced that authority and long upheld that is FERC's central role in transmission governance. Importantly, FERC applies a comprehensive oversight framework that includes prudency reviews, goes over cost allocation rules or governs cost allocation rules, and has rigorous Federal Power Act requirements around all rate filing proceedings that utilities must engage with. And I think the important point there is every transmission owner in PJM, that includes Pepco, Delmarva Power, Baltimore Gas and Electric, they must file with FERC and follow these rules to recover any transmission-related costs in their rates. Importantly, these filings are fully public. They are open for parties to engage in. They include thorough and extensive review of projects, all of these assumptions we've talked about here today, planning assumptions that go into them, needs for the projects, how the projects were executed, was that done effectively? And this includes data requests from parties, hearings on this matter, with scrutiny over all of the projects that are undertaken along the way. Importantly, I want to underscore that Maryland stakeholders play a very active and important role in this process. The Maryland Public Service Commission, Office of People's Counsel, consumer advocates, environmental groups, and candidly, any stakeholder that's interested has the ability to, and they do actively engage in these proceedings. They do question, challenge, seek to understand all the projects that utilities are undergoing. These proceedings include hundreds of data requests from parties, and as I mentioned, will and do include hearings to review the prudency of these things. These data requests and testimony that I'm referring to are an important foundation, an element of the stakeholder process, right, to make sure that there are checks and balances in the system and that folks are getting comfortable with all the information we're talking about here, forming their opinions about them and bringing that forward to the regulator before any final determinations are made on cost recovery. And importantly, if costs are not supported with that evidence, FERC will not provide cost recovery of any of these investments and allow utilities to pass them on to customers here. So really just wanted to make sure that kind of framing was provided in terms of how PJM runs its supplemental project review process, what its kind of roles and responsibilities are in things versus how that relates to to FERC, where we're ultimately getting into that regulatory oversight around the costs of projects, the rate impacts of them, and how customers will ultimately be charged for them. I think importantly, all of these mechanisms work together to ensure that there is transparency and coordination along the way. No spending is, again, as I mentioned, authorized or prudence determinations made prior to any of those investments being presented to FERC in a full evidentiary hearing. And with that, I think Maryland benefits from one of the most robust and multi-layered oversight systems that we have across this country for transmission planning, and one that importantly ensures that customers are protected and that there's transparency provided along every step of the way while we work and endeavor to work with our stakeholders to provide a reliable and resilient grid. With that, I'll thank you for the opportunity to testify again before you this afternoon, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have at the end.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Frayne?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the committee. My name is John Frayne. I am the Vice President of Regulatory Policy and Strategy for BGE. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon to provide you hopefully more information, particularly on the Port Covington portfolio of projects, as well as on other supplemental transmission projects and work, necessary work that BGE is undertaking and will be undertaking. I wanted to follow on from Mr. Lemming's discussion about the process that happens at FERC around prudency and cost recovery, and fully agree with his statements about it. I do want to ensure that it is abundantly clear to you that that process does happen after the spending occurs and once the assets are actually in service for customers. So at FERC, that process happens after the spending has occurred, and it happens annually. And in that update process, there is a number of things that happen. One is BGE holds an annual meeting with all stakeholders to present to them what our annual update looks like. We give them an opportunity to understand. We'll present the drivers of what's happening with our transmission rates. We'll talk about variances. And it's essentially a meeting that kicks off the data request discovery process that Mr. Lemming was talking about. That process includes both the Maryland Public Service Commission themselves. They participate in that process directly every year, as well as the Maryland Office of People's Counsel. And as Mr. Lemming was saying, BGE as well gets hundreds and hundreds of data requests from both the Maryland Public Service Commission and the Maryland Office of People's Counsel, as well as any other stakeholders who want to participate. And we do respond to those, and those have resulted in ultimately discussions back and forth. At the end of the day, if a party believes that there is an item in our rates that they should or want to take issue with, they are able to take issue with that. There is a process at FERC. There is something called a preliminary challenge, and then ultimately if the preliminary challenge can't be resolved, there would be a formal challenge that would go in front of the actual FERC themselves. We endeavor to work with the Maryland Public Service Commission and the Maryland Office of People's Counsel before we get to that formal challenge process. And so ultimately, pretty much every year in recent years, that process has actually resulted in black box settlements where there are certain amounts that are given back to customers, not because something's been found imprudent, but because the process is working and the stakeholders have the ability, the transparency, and the insight into our costs, the rates, and the work that customers are actually benefiting from in those rates. For the state level, I also want to level set that for the Port Covington portfolio of projects, and quite frankly, for many of the supplemental transmission projects that BGE does, those projects can include and do include both distribution work and transmission work. So a lot of times, right, always the transmission grid and the distribution network, they're connected, right? They're not separated, they're connected, and they have to be. So when we're making changes and updating transmission infrastructure or needing to extend transmission infrastructure, we're also going to many times be doing work to the distribution system at the same time to make sure that those interconnected points are actually properly working. So I want to level set that, because that does mean that in the state regulatory process, there actually is transparency and insight into the distribution work for, we'll call it as an example, the Port Covington portfolio of projects, as well as the transmission. And that is happening for both BGE and PEPCO and Delmarva because of actually the multi-year plan process that is currently in place here in Maryland, and that BGE, PEPCO, and Delmarva have been using in recent years. And the reason that that multi-year plan process is important here is because it is only with the upfront discussion, transparency, and review of what the work is going to be in the future. Multi-year plans look at up to 3 years in the future of what the utility work is going to be and what our work plans are. Whereas in the FERC process that we were talking about at the transmission level, stakeholders only really get to see the costs on the back end, right, after the work is done, after the assets have been placed into service, and at that point, the dollars have already been spent, right? The multi-year plan process is really important from an affordability perspective, as well as important from an actual planning perspective, to make sure that the utilities are actually focused on the work that all stakeholders believe the utilities should be actually investing in, because we know that there are a limited amount of dollars, and that ultimately what we want to see, and the only thing we want to see on customer bills, are the investments in the work that all stakeholders agree are what the utilities should be looking at doing. And so, you know, for the Port Covington portfolio of projects in particular, BGE's first multi-year plan, which we actually filed back in 2020, it included the Port Covington portfolio of project work that we believed we were going to be doing at that time. If you recall from Ms. Thomas's testimony, over the past several years, that work has changed and the cost estimates have changed. Back in 2020, this was the original estimate of the work that was going to be done in that Port Covington portfolio. That was actually part of BGE's multi-year plan, the distribution portion of that project. But importantly, because the multi-year plan process is so transparent and upfront, we actually provided to all stakeholders in the discovery process project authorization materials, internal project authorization materials that had details about scope, what the work was being done, the cost estimates, all of that in the course of the discovery process. And actually, the Maryland Office of People's Counsel had some issues with what we were planning to do there, and they included some testimony in that proceeding, in that multi-year plan proceeding, about the Port Covington portfolio of work at that time. Then fast forward to 2022, those cost estimates, as Ms. Thomas was saying, had changed. Well, again, going back to that multi-year plan process, it's not a one-time thing. That multi-year plan process actually requires that the utility file an annual update of all the project work that we would be planning to do, including details on what the work would be, cost estimates at the time. And so, again, the Port Covington portfolio of work, the distribution portion of it, was included in those annual project list updates. And the reason that I think that's important is because I want to make sure that it's clear that the process that we have here in Maryland for multi-year plans ensures that upfront discussion and also ensures timely updates to what work is going to be done. Again, we file those project list updates at the beginning of each year. So at the beginning of 2022, at the beginning beginning of 2023, at the beginning of 2024, at the beginning of 2025, we're filing updates to all of those projects and the costs. And again, once again, stakeholders have an opportunity to actually ask all of the, data request discovery questions that they might have on that work. So I wanted to make sure that it was clear that there is a very robust, open, transparent process here in Maryland for review of work that we do here, and it is done through that multi-year plan process. The other thing I would like to mention here at the state level is that, as you may be aware, there is certain permitting requirements, right, in the state for different types of infrastructure work that we do, and transmission infrastructure, certain transmission infrastructure that may, have a need for land or have environmental impacts or, otherwise have to go through what's called the CPCN process. CPCN stands for Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. And the transmission projects that we do, these supplemental transmission projects that we do at BGE, many of those do go through that CPCN process. Some go through the full CPCN process. Some go through what's called a waiver process, where you have to go before the Maryland Public Service Commission and ask for a waiver of a CPCN. And then there are others that don't go through that CPCN process, mainly projects that revolve around, sometimes you might need to actually replace just one piece of a transmission substation, right? Maybe a breaker needs to be replaced. When you're replacing one piece of a substation like that, today doesn't need a CPCN because you're not impacting land or the environment or any of the other things. But once again, there are permits still that you are required to get to do that work. And so while it may not go through the CPCN process at the Maryland Public Service Commission, it does go through other permitting processes and requirements that we have. So I'll stop there and just say, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Mr. Argentino, my colleague, is here. He is here to provide some more clarity on the cost estimates for the Port Covington portfolio of projects and the work that is being done there. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to turn to you next, Mr. Argentino. You're the final witness on the panel, and then we're going to open up with some questions, okay?
Good afternoon, Chair and Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today. My name is Michael Argentino. I'm the Principal Project Manager that is overseeing the Port Covington portfolio. As a Baltimore City resident myself, it is a privilege to lead this work for the important investment into Baltimore's future. The Port Covington transmission portfolio serves a dual purpose, each benefiting customers in Baltimore City. One, it enhances the reliability for 45,000 existing customers throughout South Baltimore, including residents, small businesses, multiple state and federal agencies, healthcare facilities, critical infrastructure, and more. Some of the neighborhoods include Cherry Hill, Ridgely's Delight, Otterbein, Federal Hill, Locust Point, and Westport. And some of the examples of these critical customers include the University of Maryland Medical Center, the University of Maryland Baltimore campus, Fort McHenry Tunnel, MTA, Federal Reserve, Baltimore City Police Department, and the Wheelabrator. Two, it also supports development completed and planned at Baltimore Peninsula and throughout South Baltimore. This means the project does more than accommodate load growth. It addresses reliability and environmental risks from critical transmission and distribution infrastructure that dates back to the 1950s. Replacing aging equipment also reduces future maintenance expenses. This project is highly complex from a design, engineering, and execution perspective, but I would like to provide a brief overview of what it entails to ensure this committee has a snapshot of the scope. We are replacing the 70-year-old Gould Street substation with the new Port Covington substation. Gould Street is at the end of its useful life and capacity. In other words, it poses a serious risk to reliability, and it will not be able to support the forecasted load by mid-2028. If development at Baltimore Peninsula were to stop tomorrow, we would still run into this capacity constraint. We are retiring an old oil-filled transmission line that connects the Westport substation to Green Street. The replacement, which will connect to Port Covington, removes an environmental hazard while also improving reliability. We are installing new underground transmission line from Green Street to Port Covington. The line networks several substations to improve resiliency and operational flexibility. Transmission work requires significant investment, costs that are sensitive to macro and microeconomic forces, siting and scope uncertainty, permitting and regulatory timelines, and other factors outside of BGE's control. As you know, the estimate cost for this project increased from 2019 to 2022. There are four primary drivers that behind that cost increase. While these drivers do overlap, they are not separated dollar for dollar, and I'll walk through them in order of overall impact. Driver number one, site selection and land constraints. BGE and the developer finalized the only viable site for Port Covington in 2021. This was after we released our initial project estimate cost. The site's limited footprint combined with the surrounding development necessitated a two-story enclosed substation. This is the first time BGE has constructed this type of facility, and it adds design and construction complexity and cost. Driver two, engineering and design changes. To ensure operational safety and reliability for the long term, we determined that work at Westport Substation required additional demolition, more complex civil work, and specialized equipment for challenging soil and groundwater conditions. Driver three, transmission routing and schedule compression. BGE has been working with Baltimore City and the developer since 2021 to identify a route for the underground segment of the transmission lines that will connect Westport to Port Covington. We have been coordinating closely with multiple stakeholders for about 5 years and still have no official path has been secured. We did not anticipate this process to take 5 years, and our revised compressed timeline has cost impacts on design, permitting, procurement, construction activities, equipment deliveries, and more. Driver four, market conditions. Finally, the project has been affected by market-wide cost escalations that were not anticipated in the original pre-COVID estimate. Since that time, labor costs have increased 27%, material costs by 50%. These increases are not only being experienced across the construction and infrastructure industry and are not just unique to this project. In addition, anticipated federal tariffs have further contributed to cost escalations as a significant portion of this project's high voltage electric equipment is imported, resulting in higher material prices beyond those assumed in the original pre-COVID estimate. Today's cost estimate reflects a substantial impact of these four drivers. I'll close with a word about BGE's decision to temporarily pause the Port Covington portfolio. The pause does not change the underlying reliability needs in this part of the city, but it's a deliberate step to allow us to deepen engagement with local residents, community leaders, and incorporate any updated development plans from the Baltimore Peninsula's new ownership, and thoughtfully consider recommendations from the Senate President and this committee. Above all, these investments are the right thing to do for our customers, the City of Baltimore, and the State of Maryland. I'm committed to delivering this project safely, reliably, prudently for South Baltimore and all BGE customers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to take questions. We also have, as I mentioned at the outset, Mr. Baker from the Public Service Commission here for questions. Let me just I'm going to throw a few questions out, then I'll open it up to everybody else. So, Ms. Stanek, I took some notes as everybody was saying, providing their testimony. You alluded real quickly to litigation pending at FERC. Is it over the supplemental project process, or just give me a little sense of what the nature of that particular litigation is?
The litigation was filed by a number of plaintiffs, otherwise known as complainants, before FERC in a Section 206 proceeding back in the end of 2024. FERC has taken no action on it yet. There is an open question of whether supplemental projects get the same level of review as other projects in the PJM planning process. And this complaint was applied against all 7 grid operators in the United States, not just PJM. That docket has now been open for close to a year and a half, but FERC has not taken any action on that piece of litigation as of yet.
Fair enough. Okay, Mr. Frayne, the question was, you testified that FERC can deny cost recovery, can. Has that ever happened? Has FERC ever disallowed cost recovery?
Well, yes, I think I can safely say that FERC has disallowed cost recovery, but I would just also add that for BGE in particular, and I believe also PEPCO and Delmarva, Mr. Lemming can confirm, most of the time, if not all of the time, these types of, the annual update process at FERC for our transmission formula rates actually typically ends with some sort of settlement agreement between the parties before it gets to a formal challenge, that would go before FERC. And so the way that FERC has the process set up, they're really encouraging the parties to actually work together to come and find basically a solution to whatever, questions and issues the parties may have. And there's a lot of incentives, obviously, for all of the parties to come together. I think that they've found that that's the most efficient way to deal with issues.
Okay, now, Mr. Lemming, you made reference to cost allocation rules. It's not clear. Just put it out there. How are the costs distributed? Is it across the interstate grid, through the entirety of the interstate grid, or specifically to the utility territory customers? How does that work? Your reference to cost allocation rules.
Yes, FERC does oversee allocation processes. Each utility's service territory represents their transmission zone. Costs that are incurred in the transmission zone are generally allocated across that zone, right? So for PEPCO, we'll have projects in Maryland as well as in the District of Columbia, and there are allocators that are kind of used depending upon the demands that each jurisdiction draws in the system to allocate those costs across the zone. There is also a process whereby the transmission grid is interconnected across all 13 states in the District of Columbia, and there are some costs that can span the broader transmission grid, but by and large, the vast majority of costs are allocated and recovered within a transmission owner's footprint across the jurisdictions where those assets reside.
Okay, and the final question is, there's been discussion about Port of Covington. I guess final thing is trying to get the universe of projects. Specifically, this would be, I guess, for both BG and PEPCO. What is the totality of the projects currently pending before FERC, and just give us a sense of what kind of dollar figures we're talking about, because ultimately this committee is interested in potential impacts on our ratepayers. So that would be one. And then secondly, what's now still in the queue? So, I'm particularly thinking about projects in design engineering that have not yet been put forward to FERC for approval. So if you could give us a sense of just, again, the universe here, dollars-wise, then we know what we're dealing with beyond just the Port of Covington project. And then I'll yield to everybody else here, starting with the Senate President.
I'll just start off noting for PEPCO and Delmarva Power, I think there may have been some figures that have flown around recently about the number of projects that have gone through this process. I will say in recent years, we're looking at about $100 million in project costs that have gone through the process in the past decade. And for Delmarva, it's about $200 million. If you take a longer time horizon, that number may be larger. But I do not think there are significant volume of dollars for our utilities at this point that are in queue to go through the process necessarily. So I hope that answers your question. I'm happy to follow up.
On BG's front, what about?
Yeah, so, I think that there has been discussion publicly about the amount of spend that the utilities here in Maryland have been making into the transmission systems, and the numbers that have been thrown out there are in the billions. Those numbers, really importantly, are over multiple decades. So, I would say it's also important to understand that, when you look nationally at what other utilities are needing to do as well, we are not outliers here in Maryland. In fact, the BGE, Pepco, and Delmarva Exelon utilities here, if you look at the percentage of investment that we're making into the transmission systems compared to the other investments that we're making that are, distribution and are regulated by the Maryland Public Service Commission, we're actually in the bottom quartile of utilities nationally that are investing in those transmission level investments. So, we really are thoughtful about what we are doing and need to be doing in terms of when we make those transmission level investments and how we make them. So over the past couple decades, there have been hundreds of millions of dollars invested into transmission assets, but that needs to be kind of compared relatively to the overall investments that are being made in the transmission system across the country. And to be clear, back when transmission formula rates were first approved at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they were approved there because there had been essentially a dearth of investments in the transmission system, and the federal government understood at that time that there was a real pressing need for more transmission investments, and that's why this process was first begun a few decades ago.
Before I turn it, just to my question, how much is currently pending in front of FERC, and then those that are likely to get to FERC, give us a little idea dollar-wise about the costs we're talking about.
Yeah, so each year when our transmission formula update, I'll speak to BGE, when our transmission formula update goes through that process, that transmission formula update on an annual basis, I think it can be in the $100 million to $200 million range that is going through that process at that point in time, just for level of reference and context for BGE in particular. When you look at what is on a customer's utility bill, though, I think it's important to realize that the transmission component of a customer's utility bill is actually really, really small. So if you look at a BGE customer's utility bill, you'll see an electric utility bill might be, an average bill might be about $150. About probably 70 to 80% of that at times is electric supply, and only about 10% or so of that 70 to 80% is actually related to the transmission system.
Let's move on. We're going to go to Senate President, and then we'll go to Senator Watson after that. President Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee. Thank you for agreeing to do this. I think it is really helpful. Thank you for presenting and being here today. I think, I heard a lot about transparency in the process around supplemental, and I just have to say it is very difficult to hear that. As we've talked through this supplemental process, I have been truly flabbergasted by how many people have heard of supplemental transmission projects for the first time, even within the organizations that are represented here today. And so it's hard to hear that there was transparency in it. Certainly there were filings and public filings, and there's no doubt about that. It's just, I think that there has been an overwhelming outcry of not understanding exactly the scope of these projects. In particular, and I don't know if this is the exact data. I mean, I appreciate that there are likely enormous reliability needs that have to get upgraded. The Gould Street substation in the Port Covington there has to be a replacement. There's no doubt with the tunnel and additional development. There's no question. It's the growth and scale that ratepayers ultimately have to bear through a process that from my perspective and from many others, has felt frankly new and the first time a number of people have heard of it. Before sort of the specifics, if it's the FERC approval, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is a higher rate of return available on projects that go through FERC approval for return on equity than there is if it were a distribution project that's approved through the PSC. Is that an accurate case? Is there?
Yeah, so what I would say is that for BGE, I'll speak to BGE, the current Maryland Public Service Commission return on equity for BGE is 9.5%. And the current authorized return on equity, and I say authorized, but it's actually part of our transmission formula, and it's actually something for BGE that, gosh, it's going more than 5 years ago. There was a proceeding at FERC and basically another settlement that was reached to agree on a return on equity for BGE's transmission work, and that is 10%. So you are correct that it is higher than, the current Maryland Public Service Commission authorized rate of return. And, at FERC, there is, Mr. Stanek mentioned a Section 206 complaint. There is a process at FERC. Any party can file, stakeholder can file for review of those return on equities and basically essentially bring a utility in for a rate case and a review of that return on equity. That's actually what led to BGE's current return on equity that we have is a party did file, and we went through a process and came up with a new return on equity at that point in time. And that can be done at any point in time whenever any party believes that there should be a review of whatever that return on equity is.
In the FERC process, you mentioned that it is after. So the rate inclusion or cost recovery would come after it has been spent. Take Port Covington as an example, which of course is obviously an important project. I appreciate that there is the pause and that there is a review. I think it's unbelievably important that there be a greater discussion on this project as an exemplar of kind of the broader issues around supplemental transmission. If it's coming afterwards, you've already spent it. Is that where are the initial dollars coming from for the investment in the transmission for the projects that haven't approved?
So, to level set on how any utility investment is actually financed, regardless of whether it's transmission or distribution, all utility investments are actually financed with investor dollars for investor-owned utilities. So, even at FERC, at the transmission, for transmission investments at that level, even though cost recovery doesn't begin until the dollars have been spent, those investments are being financed by investors, by shareholders, by bondholders, debt, and that's the same in Maryland for investor-owned utilities. Even though the discussion about spending happens up front, those investments are still, we're talking about investments, right, that last for 20, 30, 40, 50 years or more, and so the way that utility rates work, customers are really only paying for those investments while over the life of the investment. So, when we make an investment today, it goes into service at the FERC level. That's when it would be included in rates. To be honest, here in Maryland, that's when it also is included in rates. It's just that in Maryland, there's a discussion and an opportunity up front through the multi-year plan process for stakeholders to have input into what we should be spending those dollars on. It's not a difference in terms of the timing of when it would be included in rates.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one more sort of question. It looks like the number of projects in the supplemental process change from sort of 2017 onwards, at least for the Exelon operating companies. That it looks like very few projects were in this queue at all prior to 2017, maybe kind of little bits and pieces, at least according to data from back to 2002. And then there is a substantial jump from 2017 to 2032 projected, at least, and I don't know if you have the same data that we have, it's 1.1 billion of costs for 4 projects that are supposed to come online between 26 and 31. those were initially at $373 million, are now escalated to $1.1 billion. That is an enormous jump, and from a process that did not exist. Now it's $1 billion, at least in BG&E. It looks like for PEPCO, it is a jump from $490 million to $843 million of projects that are estimated. I don't know if the Mount Vernon Tacoma Park substation is completed yet, but the other two look like they've had pretty substantial jobs. There's going to be increases because of labor and materials. We're seeing that everywhere. It seems like there was a shifting strategy. Some choice was made to move projects from one to the next. Can anyone speak to this?
That's a fair question. So I think and I'm not sure about the data that you're looking at. Is it just for supplementals?
Just supplementals reported through PJM.
Okay, yeah. So I think just to clarify, the supplemental projects have been around pretty much, I think, since the inception of PJM. So within PJM, there are 3 buckets of projects. It's the regional baseline projects that PJM is ordering the transmission owners to build to maintain reliability. It's the network upgrades that PJM, again, orders the transmission owners to develop to support generator interconnections. And then it's the supplemental projects that the transmission owners, recognizing that we're responsible for maintaining the local reliability, we recognize that we need to perform in order to maintain reliability. And so I think taking a look at DPL, BGE, and PEPCO, which you'll recognize with most of our projects that have taken place here recently, most of those projects are regarding replacing substation equipment that is nearing the end of its life. So to what my colleague, Mr. Frayne, noted earlier, with these breakers and transformers, they're more than 40 years, 50 years, 60 years old. And so these are prudent investments we want to make before these facilities actually fail, because if these facilities were to fail, it could lead to more disruptions on the system, which could affect our customers. And our role here really is to make sure we're replacing those things before they fail, because of the time that it actually takes to actually even get the equipment procured, engineered, designed, and built. That way it's already in service. So just take a practical example for, I think, both BGE, PEPCO, and even DPL. If you look at the underlying data, most of those projects are actual breaker replacements. Today, which my colleague, Mr. Mike had mentioned before, when we go to actually order those breakers from vendors that are outside of this country, it takes them 3 to 4 years to actually build it and bring it to us. And so, again, we're looking at what facilities actually need to be replaced because they're coming at the point where they could fail, and then we're working to replace those. That way we're not going, we work to replace those before they actually do. I think the next bucket of projects that might be on there are going to be related to lines that are, again, nearing the end of their life. And within PHI, as well as a number of the Exelon utilities, we're keeping those facilities online 70 years, 80 years, 90 years.
I'm sorry, can I just really quick, why wouldn't they be happening prior to 2017 then?
I might just want to clarify one thing with respect to. I'd have to see how you're kind of looking at the data that you're looking at there, but this goes back to one of the points I made earlier about how many projects are in queue. I think if you look at like PEPCO specifically, I think I've seen a number of like 1.2 billion or so in projects that have gone through this process. Almost all of that happened over a decade ago for a number of substations. You referenced one of them, Mount Vernon. Where this is actually a process that predates 2017, goes back to 2014, where those needs were identified. And it involved a number of large substations. So to your point, some of the dollars were a bit more sizable. But what you're seeing is, right, we went through that process in 2014, and as you're talking about substations getting constructed in an urban environment, you know, it takes quite a while in terms of the design, permitting, construction, et cetera. Mount Vernon has gone into service. I believe it was at I'd have to check the exact
date. It says 2025 here. Yeah. And okay. New Harvard was 2023.
So now we're starting to see those investments kind of complete that construction and life cycle process and go into service, and then through the annual rate proceeding, get reviewed for ultimate cost recovery, but just wanted to make sure it was clear this isn't kind of a newer phenomenon that started creeping up in 2017, at least for those PEPCO portfolio of projects. That went back over a decade to about the 2014 timeframe, I believe it was.
All right. Look, I think I will yield my time. I know there are lots of questions. I think I appreciate the information that's been provided today. I do think we're going to have to do a deeper dive in an ongoing kind of, and really would like to spend some time to understand the Port Covington one in much greater detail to understand where we're going from here.
Sure. Happy to do that.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before we go to Senator Watson, one quick follow-up, Ms. Frayne. You said that there are examples in the past about cost recovery actually being denied at FERC. Can you give us a specific example when that's ever happened?
A specific example for BGE, there's many examples for utilities around the country. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. So a lot of times what happens at the FERC level is they will, look at, and again, in this formula process that we have now, most utilities nationally are in this formula rate process when they're for cost recovery at FERC. A lot of times what happens is an issue will be raised, and this is at a higher level. So it's talking about, for example, how this gets into minutia. Inventory, materials and supplies are recovered through the formula rate. Well, when an issue gets raised in one utility at the FERC level, guess what happens? That issue percolates across all of the utilities across the country, and it gets dealt with over time across the country in the same way. That issue is one that actually did go to FERC. FERC issued a ruling, and all the utilities changed the way that they were doing it to align if they weren't aligned at that point in time. So that's just one example of an issue that got dealt with.
Well, you heard me. I put it on the table. If there's some other examples, it would be good for the committee to hear some of that. We're going to go to Senator Watson, then we'll go across to Senator Brooks.
Yeah, thank you very much. With respect to Port Covington, you had mentioned that the ratepayers see an impact once the money is spent. Is that right? So the ratepayers, with respect to the Port Covington project, have been paying for that project for about 4 years now?
No. Yeah, let me clarify. Amounts that the utility spends are only included in rates, and once the utility once those investments are in service. So, for example, what I was trying to say is, let's say that there's a $100 investment, $100 distribution investment, and a $100 transmission investment. The $100 distribution investment, let's say that money was spent in 2024, but it didn't actually go into service for customers until 2025. On the distribution level, there would have been discussion in a multi-year plan ahead of those dollars being spent. The dollars would be spent, and then rates would have been changed for 2025 for those dollars when they go into service. At the FERC level,
have the rates?
No, rates for Port Covington, there have been some investments on the distribution level. There's been work that's been done over time, so there are some dollars.
The bottom line of my question is, because the project sounds like ridiculous scope creep, but I appreciate the 4 major items that have impacted the cost over time. So my question is, one, as the costs have escalated and the project has been pushed out, are there additional costs being borne by ratepayers, number one? And number two, do we expect additional escalation in cost until we get this project complete?
Yeah, so the $400 million that I think has been, talked about as the potential, expected cost for Port Covington, that is not being paid for by customers right now. We haven't spent those dollars. Has there been some work done at Port Covington already? Yes, there has been some work done at Port Covington already. Is some of that work in service? Yes, there is some work in service, but it's not the $400 million that we're talking about here. It's pre-work that needed to be done before all of this other transmission work could be done.
All right. I think I heard Mr. Frayne say there's been occasion where money had to be given back to customers based on certain circumstances. When was the last time that happened, and do you know the amounts per user what they received back?
Well, so I can speak for BGE. In our latest transmission formula update, there was a settlement reached for, I believe it was about a $500,000 refund, and that amount with interest would be included in this year's annual update that we're going to be filing here this spring. So last year, it might have been another couple $100,000. A year before that, it might have been a couple $1 million. Every year, there's a certain amount that typically gets raised and agreed upon during the process.
And my last question is for Ms. Thomas. Thank you for explaining the M3 process. So the question is, I'm trying to really understand the difference between kind of the FERC process and the PJM, right? So the PJM is more of a push system that they order transmission to be done, and folks get that order, they do it. I heard that term, order transmission. Then I also thought I heard FERC receives a need. So that's more like a pull system. So somebody has to say, here's what's coming down the pike. I think an example was a transmission piece of equipment is going offline or obsolete, and that has to be done. Are those the differences where you would use one process versus the other?
Yeah, and let me clarify just a bit. So with PJM is focused more so on regional planning. So they're identifying needs on like a shorter term, 2 to 3 year basis, all the way out 15 years.
Right.
And so they will direct TOs to, you need to replace this equipment, build this new line, based off of proposals we'll submit to them regarding how to address the issue. So that's for regional, for baseline projects. For the local needs, those are addressed via supplemental or M3 projects, where the transmission owners, we're the ones that are saying, we have this need, and this need is based off of, using your example, an asset is nearing the end of its life, or a customer is looking to interconnect onto the system, and we recognize we need additional transmission capacity in the area, so we'll need to replace assets or build new assets to serve them.
So FERC deals with transmission. Is there ever a case where FERC would deal with generation?
So
Would generation be a supplemental project?
No.
The reason I'm asking is because there are other conversations going on that say we need more generation capacity and we need more things in the queue. And it's been articulated to me that if they use the FERC process, possibly they could do it faster and quicker than going through the PJM queue. And I'm just trying to make sure I understand the full scope of FERC and what they're able to approve.
Sure, and I'll probably two-part this with Mr. Stanek here. In the PJM process, what happens is generator developers will submit plans for potentially interconnecting new generation, whether it's wind, solar, nuclear, whatever the thing will be. And then PJM will perform studies in connection with the transmission owners to determine how would we reliably interconnect that new generation onto the system. And so several reports are created, and then the generator owner will ultimately sign a contract with PJM and with the transmission owners to say, yes, I'm going to bring this generation online, and as part of that contract, it'll also outline what upgrades the transmission owners will need to do in order to reliably interconnect that generation onto the system. So that's the usual, we'll hear people refer to it as the PJM generation interconnection queue process, or the queue process. Separately, through the recent FERC Order 1920, PJM will be engaging with the states to really perform just various scenario analysis where states' policies, such as if you have a state that's looking to interconnect more offshore wind, or if you have a state that's looking to retire a bunch of fossil fuels, those inputs will feed again into PJM's 1920 process. Well, then PJM will be doing these holistic studies in conjunction with transmission owners to determine what transmission infrastructure would be needed to, say, support 3 gigawatts of wind in Maryland, or to support the retirement of 5 gigawatts out west. And then there will be a potential for additional transmission infrastructure to be developed for those wholesale needs that are driven by the states.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, let's go to Senator Brooks, then we're going to go over to Senator Hester next. Okay, Senator Brooks.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the presentation. Do no harm. Yeah, that's the standard that PJM applies to supplemental projects. Yeah.
That's correct, Senator.
Yeah, and I guess those are the projects that are initiated by local owners.
That's correct.
For local needs.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Self-initiated by the transmission owners in a particular zone.
Right. Okay. Now, while PJM evaluates whether or not these projects negatively impact the overall grid. Does the do no harm analysis include a review of those particular projects' necessity, cost effectiveness, or whether or not a more cost-efficient alternative is available?
No, we do not review need per se. There are a number of meetings that Ms. Thomas mentioned in terms of assumptions, needs, and solutions through one of our processes, but it's not the same need analysis that we perform of the larger baseline projects, nor do we review the cost effectiveness, with one exception, and that exception is if we determine that a larger baseline project could substitute for the local project if it's more cost efficient, improves market efficiencies, or addresses state policies, then we would step in and subsume that local or supplemental project and upgrade it into a baseline project.
Okay, all right. So what kind of impact would that have on rates?
Well, obviously, the rates here are subject to exclusive jurisdiction of FERC. They will review that through a rate case, whether it be challenged or not. But typically, these transmission rates go through a formula rate methodology. Ultimately, it will end up on a utility customer's bill on the supply side.
I see. Okay. And one other question, Chair. Yeah, I was looking at how does a transmission formula rate work, and I see you get the return on the investment, the operation and maintenance costs, depreciation expense, other expenses, income tax, other taxes, and then other operational revenue. I guess that would be income from renting poles and whatnot. So all of these particular items are taken into consideration, I would guess. And then I saw that with the rate formula protocol, you look and see whether or not it is just and reasonable. So is it cost recovery or just and reasonable? How do we make that determination?
Yeah, so, in terms of what happens at FERC in this process, it is a, review, it's a cost recovery review. So there's prudency review that, parties are doing through this process to review what the utility spending looks like and what we've spent it on. The outcome of the process are the just and reasonable rates. So the review of costs is to ensure that the costs that are being incurred were prudently incurred, and that it's only prudently incurred costs included in rates that, are then determined to be just and reasonable.
Yeah, okay. And one last thing.
This is the very, very last one.
Okay, yeah. I can pass on this one, Chair. Well, okay, yeah. One last thing. The depreciation expense, now that's an add-in, but normally that's something for-profit entities. You recover that cost through depreciation over a period of time, and you get to mitigate you reduce your income. It's an expense, So, but you're adding that in into the one of the things that you can recover. So is that being recovered? And here say it's being recovered from the ratepayers. So is that being recovered? How does that impact what your taxes are? Yeah.
So in utility regulation, we use depreciation expense to actually recover the dollars that we've spent, right? So I'll try to lay out an example. If we spend $100 million on an asset that's going to be in service for 100 years, serving customers for 100 years, we don't want to make them pay $100 up or $100 million up front, right? We want to let them pay for that over the life of that entire asset. So every year we'll kind of depreciate that asset by $1 million and say over the next 100 years, your obligation is to pay $1 million of that for 100 years. So they're really paying for it over time, over the entire life of that asset, similar to maybe a mortgage, right? You're going to buy a house, plan to live in it for 30 years, and you're going to pay a mortgage for over 30 years as you live in that house. and you make that principal payment every year to kind of pay down the balance of what you owe on that house. It's kind of a similar construct to help spread out the amount that customers have to pay for that asset over that full time of its life.
Right, I see what you're saying, yeah, but I was thinking that you would be recovering that cost from IRS, reducing the amount of taxes that you would owe.
So that will reduce our taxable obligation that we owe to the IRS.
Right, which
And then
means
that ultimately gets reflected in what we
I see,
recover
I
from
understand,
customers in
yeah.
terms of our tax obligation as
I've
well.
got it. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Senator Hester, and then we'll go to Senator Carozza. Senator
Thank you.
Hester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for the utilities, and then I have a question for the PSC. Could they come up?
And Ms.
Okay.
Baker, why don't you come up?
So I had one question for each of the companies. For BG&E, and I'll just ask all three, and then you guys can answer 1, 2, 3. I noticed that there's a $263 million proposal for interconnection of a data center at Calvert Cliffs. And I'm just curious how, is that going to show up on, on all of our ratepayers' budgets, bills, or because of the tariff, will all of that be given to the data center? My question for Mr. Lenning at PEPCO is I'd like you to talk a little bit about the process by which you go through and identify a solution. For example, this committee has talked a lot about GETs and ATTs, right? And I'm curious, why some projects, are the traditional, highly capital intensive projects, and the other ones, might include these more advanced technologies. And I'm just curious if in your process and perhaps in the FERC formula, is there some incentive that makes the $200 million more traditional build a better deal for the transmission operator than the $20 million GETS alternative? And last but not least, for Exelon, I was really curious if you could answer how you determine the need for the reliability. What is it that triggers that reliability risk? Is it a NERC standard that's being violated, or is there some other trigger? Because if these projects are going forward because of a specific thing, we really need to know what standard is being used to make those judgments. So 1, 2, 3.
Yeah. So in terms of your question regarding I'll just talk about a general large data center project that's being interconnected to, let's say, the BGE transmission grid and how it's determined who would pay for those costs. So the transmission grid is networked. And what that means is that the rates that all customers who are using the wholesale transmission grid pay are called network integrated transmission service charges. And it's called network integrated service charges because it's one network. And so the costs of, a specific part of the network that's just, that might be serving a subset of customers aren't, directly assigned to those customers. It's socialized across all of the wholesale transmission customers. And so what happens with a large data center, and this is why the Exelon utilities, quite frankly, have been really strong advocates that if data centers are being interconnected, especially if a data center is being interconnected and is co-located with a generator, that those data centers are still true wholesale and retail customers and should pay the costs that all other customers would have to pay. And the reason that that is so important is because, for example, a data center who is interconnecting to the BG transmission grid, there may be large transmission investments that need to be made to interconnect that transmission customer. Those transmission investments are networked and would and can and are going to benefit all other customers as well. But that transmission customer is going to then, because we've advocated so strongly that they are actually truly treated as any other wholesale customer, they're going to pay those same network integration transmission service charge rates as all other customers, and they're going to pay based on their use of the transmission system. Those these revenues that they pay are going to serve to lower the costs that all other customers have to pay. So in essence, what's going to happen is, I'll give you an example. If, we have to spend $25 to interconnect a large data center, but that large data center is going to then, have to pay overall transmission revenues. What happens is, before the data center connects, the transmission revenues paid by other customers might be $100. After the data center connects, the overall revenue requirement might be $102. But what's going to happen is that data center that interconnects is going to pay, let's say they pay $3 a year. Well, now all other customers, instead of having to pay $100, are paying $99. So the way that, this process works with the transmission is that the rates and the costs ultimately that are borne by all other customers should be, they shouldn't be, subsidizing, I'll say, a data center that's looking to interconnect. And that's why it's so important and why we've advocated that these large load data center customers are treated just like any other wholesale retail customer.
Mr. Frank, I'm sure everybody understood exactly that, but could you, honestly, I think it would be good for the committee if you could reduce what you just said, maybe in writing to the committee to kind of articulate in direct response to Senator Hester's
question. We'd be happy to.
Because I think I think that would be helpful.
I think what he said is that in the absence of our tariff, the transmission costs are going to be socialized over all the people in my district. That was my interpretation. Anyways, we can take it offline.
Okay, let's get to the next question. Senator, back to you, Senator Hester.
So your next question, I think, was around transmission planning and how we choose between various alternatives. I might need to respectfully pass that one to my colleague, Ms. Thomas. I'm not a transmission planner, so can't speak to how we go through those technical evaluations. But I'll try to address, I think you had a question around incentives in the FERC process.
The question is if you have a choice between building a large capital project, do you look at advanced alternatives, GETs and ATTs? And in that process, is there, in the FERC formula, is there an incentive to do one or the other? Because it just seems like technology is advancing so rapidly, we would want to employ those more advanced solutions. And where in the process do you do that?
I think the answer is yes, but I'll allow my colleague to elaborate on that. With respect to incentives, I don't believe there's any direct kind of adder or anything that comes with it. I'd say the incentive for us is if you're evaluating two options against each other, we ultimately bear the prudency standard that we are pursuing a solution that best meets the needs of the customers, that is cost effective, and addresses those in the most reasonable fashion. And if we're in a situation where we're comparing two alternatives, one of which is much lower in cost than the other, and it provides the same solution, the same benefits to customers, I think we're at a position where parties would advocate against us that we're acting imprudently by pursuing a much higher cost alternative, and that's the incentive for us in that process.
So do you present both alternatives when you come forward in these transparent processes that we're talking about?
Yes, so within PJM, and this is both for supplemental projects and even baseline projects, we are presenting our preferred solutions as well as alternatives. And so just as a general note for ATTs or GETs, which usually includes DLR, which is an operational tool, advanced conductors.
You're going to have to tell us what DLR, because
so sorry, dynamic line ratings. Advanced conductors, power system controllers, and I believe switching. These are all tools in our toolbox to ultimately addressing whatever the reliability issue is. And so when we're putting these solutions together, we're looking to see what is going to be cost effective, what is going to be reliable, and then we will choose those solutions and even tee up those alternatives. And I believe even for BGE, we have utilized one of the GETs ATTs is advanced conductors, and we are utilizing those on our system as well as power system controllers. And I think there's an active pilot going on for dynamic line rating. So we do utilize these technologies in our projects, and we tee them up also as alternatives when they've been appropriately considered.
So you have an active pilot, but not one of these supplemental projects is fully going with some of these
So the pilot is specifically with dynamic line ratings. I'll need to check which utility, but for advanced conductors, we are utilizing those to address baseline projects within PJM. So it just depends on what the project is in which we'll utilize it.
So you do not currently have any supplemental projects that use GETs or ATTs?
I would need to go back and check.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Then the reliability question was for, I guess, for either one of you, but we need to know the standard by which these supplemental projects are triggered. What is the reliability standard that says, okay, we absolutely must have, a new project? What is that standard?
So on PJM's website, and this goes back to our assumptions meeting materials, we have this information online that goes into each of the drivers for supplemental projects, as well as the methodology and criteria that we utilize. So to just give a practical example, if there was a customer request where we recognize a customer requested for 50 megawatts of load onto the system, we would evaluate to see if whether or not the distribution system could actually handle that capacity. And if it could not, then it would trigger the need for a project because we literally do not have the capability to serve that load with existing infrastructure. But again, those materials, they are posted on PJM's website for the different drivers for supplemental projects.
I think that if you could get back to us with the specific number, because there's got to be a standard, like a NERC standard or a FERC standard or something, some number of reliability, unless it's just like there's like a range and it's a judgment call.
So on our, within our assumptions, we tee up what each of the drivers are, and then we also note our FERC 715 criteria, and this is probably getting way into the weeds. It goes into the NERC transmission planning standards. I think it's standard, 1-4 or 1-7, which goes over the different types of outage analysis in which we would review to determine what facilities we would need to replace due to overloads on assets due to voltage issues on our system.
So if you could get back to us, this committee likes to get into the weeds, so if you could get back to us with where it is and where the reliability standard is that you're referencing very deep in the FERC manuals, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
And do you have a question for Mr.
I do have
Baker?
yes.
Yeah, why
Sorry,
don't you get that in, then we're going to go to
Mr.
Senator Carrozza. Mr. Baker? Senator Hester for Mr. Baker?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Baker, for being here today. I'm curious if you can give me a bit of your history on your engagement at FERC from, both the PSC and OPC's supplemental transmission. I think that one of the organizations has a complaint about what's going on there. And I was just curious if you could talk about what your experience has been like in the process.
All right, so some of this might have to come back to you in writing. So we have previously challenged some of these projects. My understanding is that they've been largely unsuccessful. So we have a couple individuals that do pay attention to the FERC proceedings and various things. And if they have concerns, they'll ask questions. And if we think we need to get involved, we'll get involved. In terms of our exact involvement today on a specific complaint, I will need to get back to you on which of those complaints it is.
When you go to these to the proceedings, there was multiple testimony that these were highly transparent. My experience in some of these things has been that there's so much going on at PJM, it's pretty hard to find which meeting you're supposed to be in when, and the meetings, are not recorded and there are no notes. Could you speak a little bit to how transparent you feel the process is?
So I personally have not sat in any of these, so I think but I think we do have individuals that sit in and go to these on occasion, but I won't say occasion, we do have people engaged, but I think I'm not able to answer from that perspective of do we feel frustrated by the process and getting information. I can ask those individuals to confirm their experience in terms of if they've had frustration with the transparency of getting the information they need to make recommendations on these projects. I think
fundamentally the committee is trying to understand that there were several people who said it's a transparent and open process and we listen to our stakeholders. Mm-hmm. You're one of our key stakeholders, right, as is OPSI and the PSC, and we're just curious in hearing what your experience has been like. And when you do raise something, how often do they actually address your concerns? So I understand if you can't answer now, but if you get back to us with some examples, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Okay, Senator Carrozza, then Senator Harris. The only thing I'll tell the committee, we have I think a hard break is going to be about 3:15, okay? I just want to put that out there.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chair.
Carrozza, and then Senator Harris.
Thank you. I have two questions. One, I'm a process person, so I really like PJM's chart and where you kind of walk us through that process. Following up a little bit on the transparency question that the Senate President raised and Senator Hester, I just wanted to, I kind of went through and tried to star where the engagement was with the public. So I saw engaged stakeholders in reviewing the proposals at TEAC, and then I saw down local and state authorities. I wanted to better understand that process with the transparency, and then I also understood from the utilities that you all were saying you have these annual reports that you submit regarding, I guess, updating the supplemental transmission projects. So I want to understand that. So I'll ask that question first, and I have a second question regarding security.
Thank you, Senator Carrozza. So this document you have in front of you, this flow chart is PJM's planning process for its larger, what we call regional or baseline projects. And as you noted, it is a very robust process. We have everybody from property owners to legislators that participate in this process. It's called TEAC, Transmission Expansion Advisory Committee. That's where PJM competitively reviews transmission projects that have been proposed by a range of developers, whether it be the incumbent utilities or entities from out of state. After all those projects are reviewed, PJM's board determines which is the best fit to solve the problem that we're experiencing. And as Senator Frey-Hester alluded to, PJM uses both national and regional NERC standards in making its determination to resolve a need that PJM has identified. After that solution has been anointed by the board of directors, then the handoff goes to the Public Service Commission of the relevant state to get that permit in hand. The developer would be in charge of filing an application with the Public Service Commission, beginning an evidentiary hearing, and ultimately culminating in a determination by the PSC whether or not to grant that permit.
And then the PSC transparency process would kick in at that point?
That's correct. There's extensive due process, town halls in each of the affected communities, an opportunity to participate in the trial-type evidentiary hearing at the Public Service Commission. And after the commission assumes that body of evidence, they will render a determination on whether or not to grant the transmission developer the approval to build that project. So everything on this blue sheet is with respect to regional planning. Obviously, the focus of today has been supplemental projects or local planning. There are similarities, yet differences, because the first dot here, instead of PJM identifying the need, it is the transmission owner identifies the need without the help or assistance of PJM. And then as you go around the circle, there are differences in terms of the review. There is still a public review at PJM. It's a different level of review. There is no board approval of supplemental projects. So it's an expedited process as opposed to the full process you see on the sheet.
Okay, and I appreciate that, and I'm probably going to, with the transparency, just one quick follow-up before my other question. It's one thing when we talk about transparency, when the public does have the opportunity to raise issues, and that, they have that forum, then there's the follow-up, that, when legitimate issues are raised, it's not just a matter of we heard you, but, are they being run down? Can you comment on that?
I think so. So I think so in terms of a CPCN process, yes, there's the public engagement. So when the commission is deciding if it's going to grant the certificate, it has to take into account the public comments and the public need for this, and then it will have to balance what people have said are the negatives against it versus the positives. I guess for like, let's take a solar plant, a lot of the time when granting a CPCN for, let's say, a generator in that instance, there will be they will like put up hedges, put up things to make this look nicer or keep people from seeing it, trying to strike the balance between still letting the project come in if it is truly necessary while also trying to mitigate the public nuisance that it might be creating. And so that is something that has to be taken into account in every CPCN proceeding. Getting a little bit more to this transparency, and this is, I think, something maybe kind of going back to the previous question. An area of frustration has been there are these mandatory waivers that are currently in law, and the fact that also the underground transmission is not subject to a CPCN today. And so both of those really do kind of skirt around kind of the regulatory review process that could happen at the commission, but for those proceedings. And so I know there's a bill this year to kind of remedy that, and we definitely are on support of that to help kind of get more data into the public record and have these transparent discussions to try and remediate maybe some of the issues that would come up
Up front
than in the back end, because I think there are groups of projects, as have been discussed, that don't have to go through it at our level.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My last question is for the utilities. We've been discussing these supplemental transmission projects, and we discussed some of the factors that drive up the cost. You had the example of materials and supplies post-COVID, and that is understandable. What we haven't discussed, and I wanted to understand it possibly related to cost, are security costs, physical infrastructure, cybersecurity, especially given current world affairs. So my question is, are there going to be increased security costs that would affect rates? And then, since I am a DP&L customer, Delmarva Power and Light customer, I'd like to know if there's anything you can comment about security cost or security with that utility.
Certainly, with respect to security, as you noted there, with where we are, there is a significant focus on security of our assets from a physical perspective that is requiring investment to make sure appropriate things like fencing, monitoring, et cetera, are put into substations to protect those assets and make sure that we do not have any significant events impacting our system and ultimately our customers from a security standpoint. So that is something that we are very focused on, and there is work currently ongoing to ensure that we are addressing for the security of the grid.
Would they be factored into the individual supplemental transmission projects?
Yes, if there is a project going on that is a supplemental project, we will make sure that we have the appropriate
And I'm not
security.
questioning the cost, it's just that
Yes.
we have to recognize that, okay, and so.
Yes.
Okay. And then the security costs would affect the rates the same way the other costs are affecting this overall project?
Yes, as the asset would go in, that would be a part of the cost basis that gets included in the whole process that we've talked about today, yes.
And then the Delmarva Power question, just from the standpoint of just getting on the record that security.
Yes, so the ultimate rates that Delmarva customer powers pay ultimately reflect these costs in our security that we're paying for, and ultimately we think are a critical part of safely and securely providing a safe and reliable service to our customers in the Delmarva
And you've
Power
anticipated
region.
those costs even in light of current world affairs
Yes.
being a little volatile?
Yes, that is a primary focus of ours in
Okay.
planning the system, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Senator Harris and then Senator Hester. If you do have a question, you'll have the last question. You sure? Okay. Okay, Senator Harris, I think you're going to be the last question, and then I think we're going to have to
Appreciate it,
adjourn.
Mr. Chair. Hopefully this one's going to be quick. So obviously we had a lot of discussions today, a lot of questions, a lot of answers to a lot of complex things. So for me, I'm just looking at it from your average ratepayer, right? We understand the reliability. We understand these are things that needs to take place. Some ratepayers may see this as a money grab, right? They may say, this is what utilities want to do to get extra money. My question to the utilities, and not all, just one person can answer. The question is, when you all create these plans and develop the plans, is the ratepayer in your mind in terms of not just reliability, but how can we, with these projects, save the ratepayers money at the end of the day? How does this project, one, provide them reliability, but two, eventually help them to save money in their pockets?
Unequivocally, yes. Our customers are first and foremost to everything that we do and how we operate. I think we pride ourselves in trying to be one of the most efficient utilities in the nation, on top of being one of the most reliable and secure utilities that customers can count on. It's a core to what we do. We are constantly looking for ways to drive costs out of our business, to make sure that our rates are as affordable as possible, that our grid is as flexible and efficient as possible so that folks can interact with it in the way that they would like to. And ultimately that we're providing the service that customers expect from us at the most reasonable cost that we can. It is, I think, one of the most critical core things to how we operate as a company.
So in other words, at the end of the day, it is part of your equation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Hester, you'll have the final question.
Okay.
Oh, okay. You had more questions, Senator Brown?
Just one, very quick.
Okay, how about your one, and then Senator Hester, our Energy Subcommittee Chair, will have the final word. Okay, Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Chair. And this is definitely under transparency. You know, how difficult would it be for the transmission cost to be broken out on an invoice from the distribution costs? I know transmission is for distribution is local. Is that a difficult project? At least when people can see these things broken out, it would probably make it easy for them to at least get some idea of what's in play.
So Senator, here's what I would say. First, those transmission rates are available to customers in each of the utilities' tariffs. So those rates are publicly available to customers. At the same time, I understand, your point that, like, how difficult would it be to just put a separate line on a customer's bill for that transmission? At the end of the day, it could be done. It also would cost money to, put that onto customers' bills. The other part of it is it's a little bit more complicated because of the way that, I'll take BGE, for example. We offer what's called standard offer service to customers, which means that if they are not shopping, they, are able to take service from BGE. That is a bundled service, and so it is, in order to have a competitive market where other suppliers can compete, you have to make sure that you have apples and apples, right? And so it's a little bit more complicated than the question. Could it be done? Yes. Will it cost? Yes, it would cost more.
All right, thanks, Chair.
Okay, Senator Hester for the final question of the day.
Yeah, and my apologies, Mr. Chair, I was going to hold back, but the last exchange between Senator Harris and the panel about consumer affordability really was behind this question. So on a recent earnings call, Exelon told its investors it delivered strong operational and financial performance with results that exceeded expectations, and that with a $41.3 billion capital plan and an 8% rate-based growth, you're positioned to deliver years of earnings and growth, also while stating customer affordability is paramount. At the same time, in a Fox 45 interview, a BGE spokesperson told customers when it comes to rate increases, you just can't stop them. And so my question is, if Exxon is actively seeking to grow its rate base to drive earnings, where exactly is that growth coming from across BGE, Pepco, and Delmarva, and how much of it is going to be paid by our customers?
Well, I'll respond first, and I will say first, I'm not sure where that quote exactly comes from in terms of the Fox 45 interaction, but it's not true that customers can't do anything about rate increases. That's why we have transparent and robust regulatory processes where there are regulators. Everything that BGE, Pepco, and Delmarva do here in in Maryland, and anything that ultimately ends up being, ending up on a customer's bill goes through a robust and rigorous review process. And so it's not the case that, customers can't do anything.
Where's the growth coming from?
Yeah, and I'll get to that. I wanted to respond to the quote that I don't know exactly what was said. So your question about where the growth is coming from, that is what utilities do. We are investing in the grid, and what we're seeing right now is that we have distribution and transmission systems that are in need of a lot of replacement and modernization. To your point earlier about all of the new transmission technologies that are out there that could and would potentially be efficient and provide better service for customers. Well, if those new transmission technologies are going to actually be put into place on our systems, that is an investment that we would have to make. That is part of the growth that is being discussed there, is actually looking at making and putting those new modernized technologies onto our systems.
And you'll get back to me with where you're using the new modern technologies in the supplemental projects. Fabulous, thank you.
Okay, I think that's going to conclude. We appreciate the whole panel coming in. We had a good, robust conversation, discussion. Have a great weekend. Committee, good week. Oh. No. Okay, I got to go. Meeting, we are hereby adjourned.